guy again? Well, now you can look back and get a brief little look of who they are, so it's easy to keep up. So, now, in the last 3 pages of it, you also get 3 maps. The way I've kind of done the maps are, the very first map is the entire Roman Empire in the days of Christ. We will be covering some of these things, and our story actually starts in Italy rather than in Palestine. So that's a good one to see the whole Roman world. Then we narrow it down to Israel at the time of Jesus, how it was all divided up, where the cities are, and we will be talking about some of these cities. So it's good to see where they are, and we'll talk about the areas in which several of the rulers governed. The final page on the back is actually an interesting one. This is Jerusalem in the time of Jesus. The way we're going to start this is we're going to start this in Roman history, so we won't be in our Bibles too much today as we set up everything for going forward. The farther we go, the more into the Bible we are going to go. And by the end, we'll be reading verse after verse and kind of digging into each one. It should be interesting for you. So this glossary, if you don't have one, they're available on the side over there. Definitely grab one of those. Feel free to write down questions if you have them. I've done this 2 different ways where I've kind of taught for about 40 minutes and then you can ask questions. I've also had it where if you have a question, raise your hand. You will have questions. What we're going to be talking about today it's pretty complex. It's going to challenge you. But you're also going to find it, I hope, find it very interesting as well. And so, now what we're going to be doing is, in the next 4 to 6 weeks, we're going to be looking over the life and administration of Pontius Pilate, and basically how God put him in place to preside over the most important trial that was ever held. However, it goes further than that. So by exploring the history, we see that the Gospels were actually written by people who took for granted that you knew who the people in the story were. You knew how they got there, what their relationships were, things like that. For us, as we study it, it's history, but for them, it's happening right before their very eyes. So it's not history for them, it's current events. But it goes even further than that. There are things that are happening off screen, so to speak, to what's going on in the Bible that directly affect what is happening in the pages that we read. So I guess the best way to explain it is if I took 4 of you, so this table here, and I sent you on a journey across the country to an event, and then you go to the event together and you come back together, and then I ask you to write an account of your journey. Each of you would submit something completely different for me. You would focus on different things. You would record different dialogue, things like that. Now, if I took those accounts that you wrote when you came back, and then I also took accounts of other people who had attended the same event as yours, conceivably what I could do then is put everything in order for the way it happened. It's a difficult project, but that's kind of what we're going to try to do over the next couple of weeks, is we're going to take the accounts of the 4 Gospels, we're going to pull in history from all around the Roman Empire, and we're going to attempt to put everything in logical order, a chronological order, the order in which the events happened. So, what we're going to lead up to finally, and we're going to be a little bit beyond it as well, is we're going to lead up to the trial of Jesus as he's standing before Pontius Pilate, and we're going to mostly tell it from a Roman perspective. So, it'll be a little bit different. Now, to set the scene, it's always seemed a wonder to me that the trial of Jesus before Pilate ended the way that it did. So let's set the scene. A Roman governor, he stands before his people at the conclusion of a trial. A prisoner stands with him quietly by the side. The governor declares the prisoner innocent, and he wants to release him, yet somehow 3 hours later this prisoner is dead at the hands of a Roman execution squad. And I've always asked myself, well, how did this come to be? That governor is Pontius Pilate, the people are the Jews, and the prisoner is Jesus of Nazareth. Now, the events of this Good Friday, there are many dates for them that people suggest. 2 of the most popular dates are from 30 AD and 33 AD. I tend to think that the events of 33 AD fit a little bit more in the timeline than 30, but there is no right or wrong answer to it. But that day, it saw many strange and unusual events take place. And for the last 2,000 years, many people have raised questions about the trial. And some of those questions are, we'll put them up here. So here's what we're going to attempt to answer. We're going to answer, who is this Pontius Pilate? And we're going to say, how did he get there to be at the trial? Why is the judge the only one acting as the defendant for Jesus? And then finally, after declaring him innocent, why did Pilate have Jesus crucified? Now, by looking at the history of Rome and Judea, what it does is it says we're going to shed further light on what we have in the Gospels. And with this knowledge of history and by looking at the trials chronologically, hopefully we understand the dialogue between Pilate and the Jews during Jesus' trial a little bit better. And we come to understand why Pilate would actually condemn an innocent man. Now, where we begin and how we begin to understand how these people came to be, where God put them, we start to explore the lives of 4 Roman men. The first is Caesar Augustus. The second is Caesar, it's Tiberius Caesar. Then there's a gentleman you may or may not have heard of. His name is Aelius Sejanus. And then finally, Pontius Pilate himself. So how do we know so much about these men? Well, 3 of the 4 are actually recorded for us in the Bible. And let's have a talk about that real quick. So the Bible is our number one source when it comes to history. If anything ever disagrees with the Bible, it's always the Bible that is correct and everything else has to adjust to that. But what we can do is we can use these other sources as valuable information about the people and events. It'll help us understand the trials of Jesus in a new way. Now, when we talk about other sources, the very first one we talk about is Titus Flavius Josephus. Now, show of hands here real quick. How many of you, Intrepid Bible Studies, have you actually read Josephus before? I know some of you have. All right, we'll try this. This works sometimes and sometimes it doesn't. Many of you know Josephus, you just don't know that you do. So let's try this and see if anybody can come up with the correct answer. You remember Herod Antipas had a party, and in the party his daughter danced, and it ended up eventually with the daughter asking for the head of John the Baptist on a silver platter. You remember all this, right? What was the name of the daughter? Does anyone know? Yeah. Salome, right. Very good. But here's the thing, Salome's never mentioned, her name is never mentioned anywhere in the Bible. The only one who ever mentions her name is Josephus. So you may have known Josephus without actually knowing Josephus. So, and afterward, from here on, I'm not going to call him Titus Flavius Josephus. I'm just going to call him Josephus. It's much easier. He wrote 2 famous books, Jewish Wars and Antiquities of the Jews. There's another source about the Jews that comes from Philo of Alexandria. Now, he was a philosopher that lived in Alexandria, not in Jerusalem. And he wrote a famous book called Embassy to Gaius. Gaius being the emperor at the time. Now, we're going to quote him a little bit, and we'll go through his information. For information about the Caesars and the politics in Rome, there are 3 great ancient Roman historians. The first one is named Cassius Dio. Tacitus is the second one, and Suetonius is another. Now, you're going to find in your glossaries little blurbs about them, so you can kind of keep straight who is who. And all of them cover the events in Rome in the time frame of Pilate and of Jesus. Now, this amazing research that you're about to delve into, I wish I could take credit for it, but most of it was done by a Lutheran history professor at Western Michigan University. His name is Paul Mayer. He's written a lot of books and done a lot of studies, and I've talked to him. He's a really amazing guy. So let's start with the events in Rome. So the whole history of the world was designed by God's will to lead up to the events that happened in Jesus' time. It was God's will that Tiberius was Caesar during Jesus' death. It was God's will that Pontius Pilate preside over his trial. Now, let's take a look at the plan that God put into place for these 2 people to begin. And it begins all the way back in 44 BC. We are about to celebrate the anniversary of this in about 10 days. Can anyone tell me what important event happened all the way back in 44 BC? Sammy?
The death of Julius Caesar.
Yes, the death of Julius Caesar on the Ides of March. So, Let's set that up a little bit. For 700 years before this point, Rome had been a republic. We know what a republic is. That's where people are governed by a senate. They're elected from their own members. We actually live in a republic, and our republic is a little less than 250 years old. This one was 700 years old. So you can imagine that the resistance that many senators would have to declaring one man, Julius Caesar, to be king of the Roman Empire. They wouldn't call it that, but in essence, that's what it was. So on March 15, 44 BC, Julius Caesar, having been declared dictator for life, he went to the Roman Senate to settle some matters in Rome before heading off to yet another war. But he did not complete his business. Instead, he was attacked in the Roman Senate. And you think you see, oh, it's coming up. There it is. Here you see the famous rendering of the killing of Caesar, where he was cut down by the daggers of many of the senators. But this murder in the Senate didn't save the Republic. Julius Caesar's nephew and close friend Octavian banded together with Mark Antony, and he punished Brutus and Cassius and the other senators who had murdered Caesar. Now, once this was accomplished, of course, then Octavian and Mark Antony turned on one another, and eventually Octavian conquered Antony and his mistress Cleopatra. This is where that whole story comes in. And in the end, Octavian was the one who came out the victor, and he was, from thereafter, he was called Princeps, which means first citizen. To us, we just know him as Caesar. Now, the book of Luke actually mentions two Caesars by name. So in Luke 2, verse 1, we all know this one from our Christmas programs, right? In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree. And I'm sure you could probably go through the rest of that one too. Yeah. But not long after that, in the next chapter, Luke 3, verse 1, we have another one. It says, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. So these two Caesars, Augustus and Tiberius, these were the first two Caesars. Octavian, when he rose to power, he changed his name to Augustus. Augustus is actually a title. It means revered one. He didn't call himself that. He called himself Julius Caesar for his entire life. But that's how he was known to everyone else, and that's how he's known to history, is as Caesar Augustus. Augustus reigned for 41 years before his death. Jesus was about 14 years old when Tiberius replaced Augustus as Caesar. Now, Augustus was a tough act to follow. He reigned for 41 years, which is a really long time. He was beloved by the people by the end, and he had a long and healthy reign. Tiberius was not like Augustus. He did not enjoy being Caesar very much. He didn't enjoy politics. And basically, he left the running of the empire to his family friend, and his family friend was named Lucius, alias Sejanus. Now, Sejanus was the praetorian prefect. That means that he was in charge of the only real soldiers in Rome. The praetorian prefect, the praetorians also served as the main bodyguards for the royal family as well. Now, he was a very ambitious man, and he rose to power quickly. And the great debate among Roman citizens was Sejanus a patriot, a great patriot, really loved Rome, or was he a villain? And that debate went on for quite a while. Now, in 23 BC, Tiberius' only son, AD, I just said BC. In 23 AD, Tiberius' son, his name was Drusus, he suddenly died. And the death of Drusus, it weighed heavily on Tiberius Caesar, and he grew weary of Rome and its politics, and he decided to remove himself permanently to the island of Capri. Now, Capri is a little island off the western coast of Italy, near Pompeii. And I think we got it. Yeah, so there's a picture of what Capri looks like. Now, because he removed himself off to this island, this left Rome in the hands of Sejanus. And Sejanus, he had an amazing amount of power, and he started putting people in place that he wanted to run the government. Now, ultimate power still flowed from Capri, so it still came from Tiberius, but Sejanus ran the empire. Now, he also controlled the imperial post. Now, because Tiberius isolated himself on Capri, that means that Sejanus could control what information that Tiberius had about the Roman Empire and what was going on. Now, Tiberius also gave Sejanus the ability to to appoint regional governors. And it was at this time that Sejanus appointed Pontius Pilate to be prefect of Judea. Now, Sejanus' power continued to grow, and it seemed only a matter of time until he was elevated to co-emperor by Tiberius. In fact, one incident in particular seems to all but clinch the matter in the eyes of the people. There was a grotto near the island of Capri. There was a cave with a lake in the middle. And Tiberius would hold parties in this cave, and you actually see a picture of it there. And at this one particular party in the grotto, while Tiberius and Sejanus and many of the guests were eating and feasting, an earthquake interrupted dinner. Now everybody, if you're in a cave, it's going to start collapsing. What did they do? They ran for their lives to get out of the cave. They got out of the cave, but Tiberius and Sejanus could not be found as part of the cave was starting to collapse. So after the earthquake, the guards dug their way back into the cave, and they found Sejanus shielding Tiberius from injury with his body. So you can imagine how well this cemented the relationship between Tiberius and Sejanus. The Roman Senate, seeing that the inevitable rise of Sejanus, they began to pander to him. They declared his birthday a sacred festival. They erected statues to him all around Rome. And since Tiberius would not leave Capri, there was no direct blood heir to the throne. So all of Rome anticipated Sejanus being the next emperor. In fact, Tiberius would often refer to Sejanus as Socius Laborum, and so you'd call him my partner in my toils. It tells you kind of how Tiberius viewed running the empire. Now you can imagine that the rise of Sejanus would also affect the rise of Pontius Pilate. Sejanus had appointed Pontius Pilate, who was most likely, by the way, an officer in the Praetorian Guard. So if we look back at the very early life of Pontius Pilate, he was most likely of equestrian rank, so middle rank, not senatorial rank. He was most likely an officer in the Praetorian Guard serving under Sejanus, so was therefore a friend of Sejanus, and that was how he got the job of being prefect of Judea. But it also means that the policies that were being made in Judea would have been a reflection of Sejanus' will. Now we know that Sejanus was very anti-Semitic. He did not like the Jews. So, odds are that a lot of what Pontius Pilate got up to in Judea was because that's what Sejanus wanted him to do. Now, all those close to Sejanus, like Pilate, they were eagerly awaiting his rise to imperial power, as their fortunes were then tied to his. So finally, in 31 AD, Tiberius, from Capri, sent this long letter with his most trusted aide. His most trusted aide's name was Macro, and he sent this letter to the Senate. And everyone knew that this letter was coming, and everyone thought, okay, well, in this letter, here's going to be the order to elevate Sejanus to co-emperor. Okay. Now, Macro, he delivered the letter to the Senate, and he quietly made his exit. Now, here's where it gets a little sneaky. The letter was delivered to the Senate, and it was very long, and it covered many, many subjects. And I'm sure that Sejanus, who thought he knew what was in the letter, I bet he got impatient waiting for Tiberius to announce his honors. And now at the end of the letter, Tiberius finally mentions Sejanus, but it was not to elevate him to co-emperor. It was actually to name him as an enemy of the state and order his arrest. So many of the senators that had gathered around Sejanus, ready to congratulate him, all of a sudden were like, well, I want nothing to do with this guy, and they just kind of fled to the other side of the chamber. This, by the way, is the Roman Senate, as it appears in Rome today. And so when Sejanus, who was obviously shocked, tried to leave the chamber, he found that the Senate had been surrounded by the Praetorians under their new leader. Their new leader was Macro, who delivered the letter. So Tiberius' letter had been so long to give Macro time to get over to the Praetorians, ensure their loyalty, and then lead them back across Rome to the Roman Senate and surround it so that Sejanus could not escape. Now, Sejanus was imprisoned, and a trial date was set. But the Roman Senate, wanting to show Tiberius that they were loyal and not a part of Sejanus' group, they had him and his family immediately executed. So Roman politics were deadly. In one day, Sejanus went from nearly being co-emperor to being executed as a traitor. And it turns out that the death of Tiberius' son Drusus, that originally had sent him off to the island of Capri, it was actually a plot by Sejanus. He had murdered Drusus and was hoping to marry Drusus's widow and thus become part of the imperial family and the heir to the throne. Now, by murdering Tiberius' son and marrying his widow, this was a pretty evil act, and everybody finally realized that he was actually a terrible villain and not a patriot. And Tiberius was not just satisfied with the death of Sejanus and his family. Everybody connected to Sejanus was now under suspicion of treason, and trials started to weed out all the Sejanus supporters. If they were found guilty of being part of Sejanus' plot, they were executed and all their estates were seized. Now, news of the fate of Sejanus hit every corner of the empire like a thunderbolt. This was a big deal. It would be easy to see how a prefect like Pilate would have his fortunes changed overnight, right? Being connected to Sejanus went from being a huge asset to a huge liability immediately. Now, you're asking yourself, why are we talking about this Roman drama that happened well before the trials of Jesus? The reason that we're talking about this, and the reason that we go through it, is these events affect directly Pilate's actions on Good Friday. Okay. So at this point, what I always like to do is I like to stop and say, okay, that was a pretty big history lesson for you guys. Questions? Now's a really good time. If you have questions on the setup of all this, or if something doesn't make quite enough sense, that's okay. This is a good time to look at that. So I'll throw it out to the group. What do you guys think? Oh, I thought you were standing up to ask a question. All right.
So much for sneaking out.
I know, right? Sorry, I didn't mean to call you out. All right. Everyone's up to speed a little bit? Yeah.
We often use in the United States the idea of the republic ideas of the Roman Empire as the basis for the republic that we have here in the United States. And Ben Franklin was always fond of saying, you have a republic if you can keep it.
If you can keep it, right.
And yet there's such big differences between the two republics. And the way ours has turned out so differently than the Roman government.
Yeah, it's very popular in historical circles to say to the United States, where is the United States in the timeline of Rome? Okay, so Rome started out as a republic. Now, I will say that it's not a republic like ours. Yes, they had elected members, but all the elected members that governed Rome came from the upper class, the senatorial class. If you were not part of the senatorial class, you were not elected to the Senate. Now, that would eventually change, and equestrians and even plebes would get into the Senate, but that is years and years down the road. The United States is not like that quite as much. We still mostly elect very rich people to the Senate. But the question that I get all the time is, great, where is the United States right now in the history of Rome? And it's hard to answer that question. Quite honestly, we're probably approaching the time right before Julius Caesar. There are some parallels. There's a lot of differences as well. So, yeah, that's a very good observation. Anyone else? It's okay, you don't have to be shy. Seems like we might be up to speed. Okay, so let's keep going a little bit. Now, where we ended our events, we're actually going to skip back in time a few years. So we're going to skip back to 26 AD. And this is when Pilate and his wife landed in the city of Caesarea in Judea. If you want to see where Caesarea is, the second map inside your packet there, you will go ahead and find right in the middle of, you'll find Jerusalem. And then if you kind of go up and to the left near the coast, you're going to find Caesarea. Now, because the Mediterranean Sea was basically closed in the fall and the winter, it's going to be late summer or early fall as Pilate takes his post as prefect of Judea. So just a reminder, back in Rome at this time, Sejanus holds power in Rome while Tiberius is on Capri. Now, little is known about Pilate's wife. The only mention of her in any of the documents that I could find is really in Matthew when she sends a note to Pilate during Jesus' trial, which we will talk about. In fact, we don't even know Pilate's wife's name. It's not recorded in any of the histories or in the Bible. However, in the apocryphal Gospel of Nicodemus, the author claims that her name is Procula. Okay. Now, it makes no difference to the church what her name actually is, but it's been commonly accepted to call her Procula, so we will. It's not known whether Pilate or Procula, whether they had any children. Church tradition says they didn't. Once again, it's not really important whether they did or not, but most likely they did not have children. But it must have been an exciting time for Pilate as he assumes his post. It's doubtful Pilate knew much about the Jews before he assumed his post. Jews and Romans did not associate with each other for very similar and very different reasons. Good Roman men tended to look down on the Jews as clannish and superstitious. They didn't associate with them much. It's also believed in Rome that the Jews were very argumentative. There's a classic Roman phrase that sums up their view of the Jews, and the phrase is, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. I think we could probably say that about Lutherans sometimes too, but you know. The man who was prefect in Judea before Pilate, his name was Valerius Gratus. He was generally considered a very good governor by Rome. Valerius had been prefect for the last 10 years, and it was a relatively quiet time in Judea. Now, the prefecture of Judea, if you look on your map, it was mostly the southern half of Palestine. It included Jerusalem. However, Pilate didn't live in Jerusalem. The seat of power for the Roman government was actually in that Caesarea that we found before, northwest of Jerusalem on the coast. The city of Caesarea was built by Herod the Great and named in honor of Caesar Augustus. Now, Herod the Great was not named the Great because of his kind and loving nature. Okay, I think we might know this. He was named the Great because everything he did was done to extremes. So all the cities, all the ports that he built, all the palaces and temples, all these were a testament to basically his megalomania. All right? In fact, the little port of Caesarea, it was actually considered one of the most well-constructed ports in the world, and still is, actually. But, unfortunately, not all of his energies were devoted to building. Herod the Great was really, really good at killing people, too. He was paranoid, he had no self-restraint, and his list of people that he killed is pretty impressive, I guess you could call it that. Just even a short list. He killed 2 of his brother-in-laws, his wife, 3 of his sons, his mother-in-law, a high priest. He killed them all because he thought they were plotting against him. Not to mention, one of the worst things he did is he slaughtered all the babies in the town of Bethlehem because 3 foreign travelers came looking for a quote-unquote king of the Jews. Now, Herod's end was actually pretty awful. When Herod was in Jericho on his deathbed, this was not long after he ordered that slaughter of the babies in Bethlehem. But when he was on his deathbed, he realized that nobody is going to mourn his passing. In fact, everyone's going to be really happy that he's dead. So he decided that, you know what, if they're not going to mourn me, then I'm going to make this a day of universal mourning. And what he ordered his guards to do was to gather up a whole bunch of important Jews and put them in the hippodrome. And as soon as he died, he was going to have his archers fire on all those Jews and killing them all. And therefore, it's going to be a day of universal mourning. However, he did actually die, and the order was rescinded. So he did not actually make it a day of universal mourning. So how did this madman get to be king of Judea? And it turns out that Herod the Great's father, his name was Antipater, he once saved Julius Caesar's life in Egypt, and his nephew, a grateful Caesar Augustus, made Antipater's son, Herod the Great, the king of Antipater's homeland. He also gave him Roman citizenship and exempted him from taxes, all kinds of benefits for it. When Herod the Great died, Rome split his kingdom among 3 of his sons. But one of the sons was such a bad administrator that Rome took his province away. And they installed a Roman governor in his place. And that is how, after governor, eventually the Roman prefect would be Pontius Pilate. And he would actually go ahead and govern the area around Jerusalem and Caesarea and what you see in your packet in front of you. Now, several of the Herod the Great's sons made names for themselves, but the 3 that inherited part of his kingdom, we hear the most about Herod Antipas. Antipas was not a king like his father, nor was he a prefect. And here you see a kind of a representation of what he probably looked like. He was not a king, he was not a prefect, he was known as a tetrarch. Tetrarch means ruler of a quarter, as in he ruled a quarter of his father's kingdom. Now, like his father, Antipas liked to build, and following in his father's footsteps, he named his cities after the Caesars. Excuse me. Now, Antipas felt that Rome had no business sending a Roman prefect to govern Jerusalem and the area, and his great desire was always to reunite his father's kingdom under his own rule. Now, needless to say, that would not sit well with Pilate. And I put his picture up here so you can kind of see the difference between the two men and what they probably look like. Just looking at them, you can see that these two guys, they're probably not besties. They don't really get along too well. Now, Pilate would have thought, well, Roman rulers should rule all of these things instead of Jewish rulers. And the two were rivals right from the beginning. Neither of these rulers ever were really popular with their subjects, the Jews. Pilate would struggle throughout his whole career being seen as the Roman yoke around the necks of his subjects. Now, meanwhile, Antipas wasn't doing much better. He couldn't stop alienating his own people. He built a city that turned out to be over a graveyard. That made that city ceremonial unclean, and no one would live there. He also married his brother's wife while his brother was still alive. This, of course, violating Hebrew law. And then he went and murdered the very popular prophet John to fulfill a foolish oath to his stepdaughter. So Herod Antipas was, even though he was Jewish, was never very popular either. Now, as Pilate began his administration in Caesarea, one of his duties, and if I go over, let me know. One of his duties would be where to put the 3,000 soldiers that he was allotted around his province. Now, the soldiers that Pilate had available to him, they would not have been true Roman soldiers. Judea wasn't important enough to station an entire legion there, and it's doubtful that many of the officers even were Roman. These soldiers and officers would mostly be Syrians, and they would have had little love for the Jews that they helped guard. For the soldiers, there was a big difference between spending the winter in Jewish Jerusalem and a Roman wintering in Caesarea. For them, it's a pretty huge difference. Now, each of the soldiers would have had their own standards and flags. Always before, the soldiers that were sent to winter garrison in Jerusalem would never have any pictures on their flags. Now, this is important. Why? Why would this be important, that not have pictures on your flags in Jerusalem? Does anyone know? There was a certain rule about graven images. And if you don't have any graven images on your flags, the Jews would accept it. If you had graven images on a flag, then they would not accept it. So when they were in Jerusalem, the soldiers would be staying at the Tower Antonia. It's also known as the Fort Antonia. There you see. Now, as you look at this picture, this is the fort here. This is where the soldiers would stay. This here is the temple. Now, you'll notice that the fort is actually tall enough to look down into the temple. And this angered the Jews for many years because they did not want anything higher than the temple, and they did not want the soldiers knowing what went on inside. Now, whether Pilate was ignorant or he just didn't see the importance of his actions, what he decided to do was send a unit to winter in Jerusalem that had the image of Caesar on their standards, their flags. And the introduction of standards with graven images into the holy city, it created a major stir in the Jewish population. Now, we have to be careful that when we're using historic texts to evaluate what's going on, we also have to keep in mind who's doing the writing. So both Josephus and Philo record this incident with the standards. Both men were Jews, and they were predisposed to think the worst of Pilate. In fact, this is one of my favorite descriptions of anyone of all time. Philo remarked Pontius Pilate that he was, and this is obviously not very good friends, he called Pilate inflexible, ruthless, merciless, obstinate, and cruel. So I don't think they were trading Christmas cards. Right? Now, Josephus, he was kinder to Pilate's character than Philo was, but still being a Jew, what he does is he ascribes a motive to Pilate's actions that needs to be taken with a grain of salt. So it might be best to hear what Josephus described as the first part of our story that we're going to start looking at. So what Josephus says is, now Pilate, the procurator, now, by the way, the procurator was not actually the correct title for Pilate. Pilate was a prefect. Procurator and prefect are the same thing. But we see this often, even from people of the age, where they called him a procurator, but his title was prefect, and we'll get into that in about 3 weeks. So now Pilate, the procurator of Judea, removed the army from Caesarea to Jerusalem to take their winter quarters there in order to abolish the Jewish laws. That's kind of what Josephus says his motivation is. We'll look a little bit further at that. So he introduced Caesar's effigies, which were upon the ensigns, so these are the graven images on the standards, and he brought them into the city, whereas our law forbids us the very making of images, on which account the former procurators were wont to make their entry into the city with such ensigns as had not those ornaments. Pilate was the first who brought these images into Jerusalem, and he set them up there, which was done without the knowledge of the people, because it was done in the nighttime. So, from this account from Josephus, we can tell several things. First, that Pilate was the first prefect to put soldiers in Jerusalem bearing images on their standards. Second, that Pilate brought them in at night. Now, it would seem to me that if Pilate were truly interested in abolishing the Jewish laws, he would have brought them into the city in full ceremony during the day. But instead, it appears that Pilate knew the Jews would object, but didn't foresee the furor that this would actually cause. It's difficult to imagine that a Roman official, just a few months into his new post, would deliberately cause a riot in his province. The mark of a good Roman prefect was always to keep his subjects calm and happy and paying taxes. But either way, the Jews woke up the next morning to see a big flag flying from the corner of the Tower Antonia, right by the temple, with an image of Caesar on it. Now, the Jewish response to this outrage was not to send a delegation to Pilate and say, respectfully, you can't do this, and this is why. But instead, what they did is, Josephus records that multitudes of Jews descended on Caesarea and camped out around his palace for 5 days, and they were interceding with Pilate to remove the standards. Pilate refused to remove them, claiming that it would be an insult to Caesar to have his images removed. And now Josephus tells us what happens next, and Pastor, you're going to have to tell me when I'm out of time. So Josephus tells us what happens next. He says, on the 6th day, he ordered his soldiers to have their weapons privately, while he came and he sat upon his judgment seat, which seat was so prepared in the open place of the city that it concealed the army that lay ready to oppress them. When the Jews petitioned him again, he gave the signal to the soldiers to encompass them around. And he threatened that their punishment should be no less than immediate death unless they would leave off disturbing him and go their ways home. But they threw themselves upon the ground and laid their necks bare, and said that they would take their deaths very willingly, rather than the wisdom of their laws should be transgressed. Upon which Pilate was deeply affected with their firm resolution to keep their laws inviolable, and presently commanded the images to be carried back from Jerusalem to Caesarea. So this was not exactly the auspicious start that Pilate would have had in mind for his reign in Judea. So one of his first decisions offended his subjects so much that multitudes of them poured down into Caesarea, and for 5 days the palace was besieged. So Pilate decides to surround him with soldiers, and he commands the Jews, depart or die. Now the Jews call his bluff, and Pilate is faced with a simple choice. He can give in to their demands, or have his first report back to Rome state that he slaughtered thousands of Jews in his first month as prefect of Judea. Now, his decision to remove the troops with the standards rather than the images off the standards, that was a pretty skillful compromise on Pilate's part. But there's no doubt that in the very first showdown, and there will be more, between Pilate and Jews, the winner was clearly the Jews. And we can also take from this incident that while Pilate was pretty obstinate, he took 6 days to resolve this, he was not, however, inflexible, ruthless, merciless, and cruel, as Philo describes him. Now, when we come back next week, we're going to get into the next episode of Pilate's administration in Jerusalem and Caesarea. And wouldn't you know it, there's another showdown coming between Pilate and the Jews. And I think I've run us over long. So, any quick questions that you have for me before we go? If not, Pastor, I'll ask you to close us in prayer, and we'll be done for the week. And I hope to see you all back next week.
Thank you, Tim. We'll pray. Gracious and loving Savior, we thank you for the records in the Scriptures of what you have done for us. We thank you for other records too that give us a greater understanding of God's plan to save us. We ask for your blessing on the week ahead as we, on our own, receive the word and also with other Christians. In your name we pray. Amen.
Your assistant, yeah.
This is really well written.